Welcome to Part 6 of The Music of Murder. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 21. Good heavens, Orbit exclaimed, his voice filled with horror. You can't mean the poor lad fell down the chute, that he's buried under the coal. Ellison, my dear friend, what can I say? This can't be true. It must be some wild speculation. Surely it's not real. It would be far too devastating, far too tragic. Ellison's face contorted, but no words came to him. Orbit turned toward the men who were gathering tools and baskets, moving toward the back of the house. I'll donate an additional 1,000 on top of what Mr. Ellison has pledged. Work harder than you ever have before. Inspector, how could such a terrible thing have happened? It's unbelievable. How could the poor boy have fallen into the cellar without anyone noticing? I suppose any cry he made would have been drowned out by the noise of the coal, but, oh, it's all too horrifying. His dismayed, shaky voice trailed off into silence, and from below, the sounds of shovels and coal falling into baskets echoed through the open chute. A groan escaped Ellison's lips. Max crouched at the edge of the opening, his front paws resting on the ledge, his nose low between them, a ridge of fur standing up along his back, and a soft, anxious whine escaping his throat. Marcus turned away, shivering, and noticed that gardener Renee had joined his son at the edge of the group. Riddle and a few maids from Mrs. Thorne's staff clustered a bit further back, alongside the Webster chauffeur, Danny Sayer, the page boy, and the elderly butler from the Sloanes. Benjamin Webster himself appeared on the steps of his home, while the lower windows of the Ellison house were crowded with servants. Above, from a window near Orbit's conservatory, the wide eyes of little Ling Sunny peered down in anxious wonder. The dreadful scrape and rumble from below continued relentlessly, as if it would never cease. Ellison stood unsteadily, but Camden wrapped an arm around his shoulders. The inspector had responded to Orbit with a serious, non-committal demeanor, and now they spoke in hushed tones while Marcus moved closer to McCarty. "Why didn't you tell me?" he murmured. "No wonder you said it was downright sickening to think about, Ty. If they find the poor boy down there, it'll be one crime that isn't really a crime at all. How did you come to know?" "I don't know," McCarty admitted honestly. "It's just the only assumption that fits the facts as I see them, but Max didn't need any guesswork. I'm relying on the dog's instincts, Max." "Just look at him. It makes my hair stand on end." Marcus shivered again. "Will they never finish shoveling? I feel like I could scream." Some of the Thorne servants had indeed started to cry hysterically, but they quieted with just a glance from McCarty. Webster was slowly making his way across the street, his chauffeur stepping aside to let him pass. Marcus noticed several older men from the detective bureau moving discreetly among the different groups. Two officials who had arrived with the inspector approached him now. He introduced them to Orbit, and the interrupted discussion resumed among the four of them. Marcus discreetly checked his watch, a timepiece that looked like it belonged in a museum. The men had been working for nearly 40 minutes. He recalled the sound of the 1 o'clock whistles when Martin came to take over his post at the east gate. Soon they would know the worst. If only the dog would stop whining. He glanced at Camden, who met his gaze with a look of desperate inquiry, but the man Camden was supporting swayed, and he adjusted his hold. Just then, Benjamin Webster stepped quietly to Ellison's other side. "Lean on me, my friend," he spoke in a soothing voice. "I'm old but strong, like an elder brother here to lend support. We will wait and pray." Ellison's eyes, dull and unfocused, filled with tears, and he rested his hand on Webster's arm without saying a word. A lump tightened in Marcus's throat. "Ty, for the love of God, will they ever finish this? It's more than anyone can bear. I've dug through a collapsed wall with my bare hands, and the best men in my crew were buried under it, but this is far worse. Orbit's done for, and it's no surprise." Henry Orbit turned, staring at the coal chute with a mix of horror and fascination. His refined features quivered, and his eyes burned with a dreadful intensity. Drawn to it against his will, he stepped forward slightly, and the officials moved with him. Then, for the first time, he seemed to notice McCarty. "Did you have the slightest inkling of this when you came to me an hour ago?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me? I have 3 strong men at my home, and I would have led them. Is this your doing?" "The inspector brought them, Mr. Orbit," McCarty replied. "I mentioned he'd be coming shortly, but he doesn't always inform me of his plans." "He should have at least let me know." Orbit ran his fingers through his darkening hair. "I could have gotten started on this, but this is utter madness. That child cannot have met such a terrible fate." "We'll know soon enough." McCarty's voice carried a note of firmness. "In just a moment more." As if his words acted as a signal, the clanking and rattling from below suddenly stopped, replaced by an electrified stillness. Then it was shattered by a rising murmur of hoarse voices, which was soon drowned out by a steady cascade of coal being flung in every direction. Orbit let out a stifled exclamation, standing frozen as another groan escaped from Ellison. One of the Thorn maids screamed in terror. Then the noise from the cellar fell silent once again, and the dog slowly lifted his nose to the air. He let out a low, mournful cry. At that moment, a dirty head and shoulders emerged from the coal chute, and a rough, trembling voice called out to McCarty. "We've found it, sir." The various groups converged and rushed toward the opening, only to recoil in horror. A hushed commotion erupted among them, but Eustace Ellison didn't hear any of it. His head drooped forward, his knees buckled, and he slumped unconscious between the 2 who were holding him up. In an instant, 2 plainclothes officers were at their side, and the unconscious man was lifted and taken into his house. Notably, neither McCarty, the inspector, nor the 2 officials offered to help. After Orbit recovered from his initial shock at the abrupt announcement, he turned and hurried into the house, with the others following closely behind. Marcus lagged slightly behind, aware of how uncertain his position was among the unfamiliar officials, remaining discreetly in the background. When he caught up to the small group, they were gathered in the rear hall in front of the open door leading to the stairs down to the cellar. Orbit stood at the front, while Wei Anya, Andre, and Clara lingered by the pantry. Orbit was peering down into the glaring orange glow of the electric lights in the cellar, listening to the shuffle of feet and the murmured voices that had lowered in sympathy. Then a slow procession began as 2 of the workers emerged, carefully carrying something slender and heartbreakingly small wrapped in a heavy dark cloth. As they ascended the stairs, both the servants and the officials pulled back, but Orbit remained where he was, silent and unmoving. His gaze followed the men as they passed so closely by him that he could have easily reached out and touched them. Then he turned and walked upstairs to his sitting room, with his uninvited guests trailing behind. Outside, the whispers turned into a rising swell of cries, only to be abruptly silenced by the closing of the door. Orbit whirled around, both hands clutching his head as a shuddering groan escaped his trembling lips. "This is dreadful," he gasped. "Gentlemen, I must demand an explanation, but not right now. I'm too completely stunned." "We need answers now, Orbit," McCarty said, stepping forward after a quick glance at his superior. "It won't come from us either." "What do you mean?" Orbit asked sharply. "Surely you're not suggesting that I knew that child was lying there. It's absurd. Do you think I would have kept that from you?" He turned to the inspector. "Inspector, when did you find out what happened to the poor little fellow?" "I didn't. It was McCarty," the inspector admitted without hesitation. "He told me this morning that he might have news for me by noon, but until he called to send the squad of men with shovels, I had no clue." "Then you," Orbit faced McCarty again. "The dog was the first to give me the idea by lingering around that coal chute," McCarty replied. A new tone edged his voice as he continued. "It seemed odd to me that you'd have that coal delivered an hour before your party, making a mess of everything. Even if it had been scheduled, you could have sent it away since you wouldn't be lighting your furnace for weeks. I found out that you didn't order it until half an hour before it arrived, and you called 3 times to rush it, yet you told me this morning that you arranged it 4 days ago. About 20 minutes before you first asked for it, you went to the kitchen and got a glass of milk from Andre." Did you drink it yourself, Henry Orbit? I did not. Orbit's gaze seemed to pierce Henry's skin. That was for Vite, the monkey. But Vite was locked up on the upper floor to stay clear of the party, and Wei Anya had the only key. Ling Sunny told me so. That child doesn't understand English well. Vite wasn't locked up until just before my guests showed up. What are you trying to suggest? Nothing. I'm just telling you what I know. Ling Sunny understands a lot more than you realize, Orbit. What time did Nathan Ellison come by to see you on Tuesday afternoon? If that glass of milk was for the monkey, then why didn't you call for it instead of heading to the kitchen yourself? Was it because you wanted to keep the boy's visit a secret? What did you put in that milk, Orbit, to make Nathan unconscious or kill him, just like you did with Griffith? I know from Andre how you got all the servants out of the kitchen and pantry afterward, so you could haul the boy's body down to the cellar without being seen. But why did you do it? What could possibly justify such a horrific act against a child who had harmed you in no way? What reason could you have for murdering the valet who had attended to your needs for over 20 years? Why did you introduce poison gas, derived from the formula you bought from Hinton Sherrod, into the Thorn baby's toy balloon, aiming to kill her and her nurse? How did you manage to have it burst when it did, and how on earth did you have the opportunity to pump gas into it? You're far from insane, Orbit. Why take the lives of these people against whom you bear no grudge, with no reason to wish them gone? Is it because of the dark legacy in your blood, driving you forward? Answer me this, Henry Orbit. I won't say a thing to you. Orbit's dark eyes blazed, but his voice remained dangerously calm. You acknowledge that I'm not insane. I can't say the same for you given these outrageous accusations. Inspector, if you're the one in charge of this utterly irregular affair, should I take it that I'm formally charged with this horrific series of crimes? Am I to see myself as under arrest? Inspector Lucien glanced uncertainly at McCarty, who gave a slight nod, a mixture of demand and plea in that small gesture. The inspector hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. You are, he replied. I arrest you, Henry Orbit, for the murders of Alfred Griffith, Nathan Ellison, and Isolde Guerin. The two other officials exchanged startled glances before stepping closer to Orbit, one on each side of him. He shrugged them off and took a step forward. Then I'll not say another word. You may continue this ridiculous charade for now. Meanwhile, may I ask for a moment of your indulgence? I simply wish to sit at that desk over there and write a brief note to the one person in the world most concerned, besides myself, about this extraordinary situation. I'll seal and address the envelope, leaving it on the desk for you to deliver at your discretion. Lock the drawers if you like. I assure you, I have no intention of grabbing any weapon from them to defend myself or attack you. The contempt in his voice was infuriating, and even the inspector winced at it, so compelling was Orbit's presence. He nodded. Write your note, Mr. Orbit, but keep it short. If word of this gets out before we can take you downtown, not even the full force of the city could protect you. Marcus turned in shocked disbelief to McCarty, but the latter was focused on Orbit, who had seated himself at the desk. He wrote, not in a rush, but with steady confidence. A faint smile played on his lips, and when he finished, he sealed the envelope with a firm hand, wrote a name and a brief note beneath it, propped it against the inkwell, and stood up. Now, gentlemen, I'm at your service, he declared. I'm ready to join you if you can catch me. The last words came out in a tone that carried a challenge, and his hand slipped beneath the edge of the desk. In an instant, before the 5 men gathered around him could react, the room was filled with thick, dark smoke that poured from the walls like the eruption of a volcano, obscuring everything in sight. Startled, the officials shouted warnings, and the inspector cried out. To the windows, watch for poison gas. McCarty pushed forward bravely, but Marcus seemed more at ease in the chaos than he had been at any moment since this all began. He shouted commands and encouragement, moving with a calm certainty as if he could see through the dense, dark fog surrounding him. The sound of their hurried footsteps and the crash of furniture as the officials pushed against it drowned out everything else until a door slammed nearby, and a taunting laugh echoed back to them. "He escaped," one of the officials gasped as he finally reached a window and threw it open. "He won't get far," the inspector shot back, determined. "Find all the windows and doors and let's create a draft. I want that letter he wrote." As the fresh air rushed in, the room quickly cleared, revealing that they were alone, except for the white envelope leaning against the inkwell, which the inspector swiftly grabbed. Gasping for breath, with his eyes stinging and watering, he leaned in to examine the inscription closely before throwing his head back in disbelief. Good heavens, it's addressed to McCarty. Chapter 22. McCarty stumbled forward and took the envelope that was held out to him, turning to the window where he leaned in to let the cool air brush over his face. It was simply addressed to ex-roundsman McCarty, with the second line reading, "Delivered by hand." He broke the seal and quickly scanned the few lines inside before looking up at his companions. "I think this is for all of us," he said. "Listen. My dear McCarty, it has been a pleasure to meet a man like you, and I part with regret, at least on my side. You are absolutely right in your deductions as far as you've explained them, and I regret that I cannot stay to hear your complete reconstruction of the case, but time is of the essence. The last drawer of this desk, at which I write, has a false bottom. Remove it, and you will find a portion of my diary from the past fortnight, placed there in anticipation of this eventuality. I bequeath it to you for your further understanding, and with my most sincere admiration, for where I am going, I can take nothing material with me, though I will not leave my body behind. I am not heading towards death, but towards annihilation. Checkmate. Henry Orbit. What does he mean? The inspector asked sharply. What kind of escape has he planned? Not taking his body with him, and yet not leaving it behind. What does annihilation mean? We will see for ourselves if we stand here guessing instead of stopping him. McCarty shoved the letter into his pocket and headed for the door, beyond which 2 French servants and a Chinese servant had paused. He's planned to destroy himself completely, body and all, and if it involves blowing up the whole house, I wouldn't be surprised. Come on. The others hurried after him, but in the hallway he stopped to confront Wei Anya. It was the man you worked for, Orbit, who killed him, he declared. You knew that, didn't you? You suspected it from the very beginning, especially after the strange way Griffith fell ill after drinking the medicine Orbit mixed for him before dinner. That's why you dressed as a Chinese laborer and went to the quarter where Griffith died the next morning to gather whatever information you could about it. If you don't want to get arrested as an accomplice, you better come clean. Which way did he go just now? I did not see. Wei Anya's expression remained completely unchanged, and his voice was calm. I only came upstairs when I heard the shouting and smelled the smoke, thinking the house might be on fire. I didn't see anyone or anything. Where is his laboratory? Where does he lock himself away sometimes, a place that none of you enters? McCarty fired off his questions quickly, like bullets from a gun. We don't have time to waste. Is it upstairs or downstairs? Wei Anya remained silent, but Clara, her teeth chattering, spoke up suddenly. It's upstairs. I see him when I reach the top of the stairs. He rushed out of that room through all the smoke, laughing. Then he went up to the next floor and beyond, and in the attic there's a room that only he can enter, secured with a heavy steel door. Show us where it is, McCarty commanded. That's where I fell short. I should have figured a guy like him would have covered all bases, even planning an escape route. He started a hurried jog to the back stairs. The others closed behind him, but Clara zipped past him, taking 3 steps at a time. Past the guest rooms and the servants' quarters, the search party hurried towards the storerooms and the attic above, pausing only before a small wooden door. I thought you said it was made of steel, McCarty exclaimed as he turned the handle and then pressed his shoulder against the panel. We'll have to break through. It's just a false door a cover, Clara explained. Just beyond is the real steel door. Are you sure he came this way? There's nowhere else for him to be hiding. McCarty glanced at the Frenchman before turning to his companions. Stand back. We'll get this down. The small door was tougher than it seemed, and it took the combined strength of Marcus and one of the officials to finally break it down. It crashed inward, leaning against a second door a foot or two beyond, revealing a solid sheet of tempered steel. We'd never get through that without explosives, and who knows what's waiting for us on the other side that could blow us all to kingdom come, McCarty shouted. Inspector, could you call for an expert from headquarters? There's nothing to do but wait. At least we know where he is, which is a bit of comfort. The inspector hurried downstairs, and the others gathered before the steel wall that separated them from whatever lay beyond, clearing away the debris of the wrecked door. There's not a sound coming from in there. Marcus moved closer to McCarty. What do you think he's up to? Setting up a powder keg, perhaps? He's not, McCarty responded sharply. If he wanted to blow us up, he would have done it in his sitting room instead of unleashing that smoke on us. He must have had that all prepared to blind us so he could make his escape. You couldn't hear a cannon fire behind that solid steel, but whatever he's doing, it's only to himself. You remember the letter he sent me. He wouldn't have mentioned his diary if he didn't want us to read it, and that's just part of who Max is. He couldn't stand the thought of the world not knowing how smart he was. Smart, Marcus shivered. But what was it all for, Ty? You asked him that when you confronted him, and he didn't respond. He had no reason to do what he did, yet he wasn't insane. He had such an impressive demeanor and a knack for making you feel lower than dirt just by being around him. I would have never suspected him at all. How you figured it out is beyond me. I had the key to all of it right from the beginning, but I just didn't realize it, McCarty replied as the inspector rushed up the stairs. I'm really frustrated that the truth didn't hit me sooner. Maybe, then the little boy and nurse Isolde would have been spared. 2 of the best officers from the department are on their way, the inspector announced. I had to take a moment to call in additional reserves to hold back the crowd that's trying to break through the gates, because the news has somehow gotten out. Martin and Yast made the first call, but the guys who showed up can't handle that mob any better than a one-armed sheriff in a riot. Is there any sign from inside? The officials shook their heads, and Clara chimed in. I once saw him go in without realizing I was close by. Before he shut the door, I think I saw others just beyond it, but they were open, and at the end was a room filled with shelves covered in bottles and strange glass tubes. There was a large round tank made of metal, taller than my head. I thought then that he might actually be a scientist, a remarkable one at that. It wasn't until Griffith died and little Nathan disappeared that I began to think he was a demon. Here comes Andre. The stout chef had struggled up the stairs, with Wei Anya's flowing robes trailing behind him like a shadow. Are you going to get him? Andre asked, his voice tight with agitation. Are you going to put him in that electric chair? Pablo, every time I think of little Isolde, so innocent and sweet, and that little Nathan, I swear I could plunge my knives straight into his heart. It was I who handed him the glass of milk that he used to drug little Nathan, and I stood there while that mountain of coal slid into the chute, none the wiser. It wasn't until my fellow countrywoman died right in front of him, and they said it was from the poison gas, that I began to remember this room and the horrible smells that came from it when he opened the door. When was the last time you saw him here? McCarty asked. On Wednesday afternoon, just half an hour before he screamed for help from the conservatory where Isolde died. He spread his small, plump hands in an expressive manner. I think he comes to this room because I was in my own room with the door slightly open, and I saw him pass quickly and quietly, going up the stairs. He was carrying something round and blue at the end of a stick, and I thought I was mistaken because it looked just like a child's toy balloon. Still, I kept watching, and a few minutes later he came back down, still holding the balloon. I told Wei Anya about it later, but he hadn't seen anything like it in the conservatory and didn't believe me. Look here, Wei Anya, why didn't you tell anyone what you knew? McCarty addressed the Chinese man, who stood off to the side, quiet and seemingly indifferent. Why did you let Orbit continue with his crimes when just a word from you could have stopped him from doing any more harm? Orbit comes from a wealthy family and holds considerable influence among the powerful, and he is a white man. Wei Anya replied in his flat, melodic voice. I too come from a noble lineage, and have earned respect in my own country, but I was forced to flee, and now I find myself a poor servant without friends or allies, and I am yellow. Who would believe my word against his when I have no evidence? I could have been thrown into your prison, but even there, Mr. Orbit would have reached me and silenced me. I had to think of little Ling Sunny, my nephew, who is meant to receive an education and return home to teach my people. I could not abandon him without protection. I could only wait for you, who are white men as well, to see the truth before you. You have a point there, McCarty acknowledged. Isn't that the bell? If it's the men we summoned, bring them right up. He might have killed himself before we got here, Clara suggested. There's a pistol he keeps in the drawer of the small table beside his bed, and today, when he pushed me aside at the door of the card room to rush out and see why all those men with shovels had come, I felt it pressed against him as he shoved past. It's always loaded. I know that because I've looked at it more than once. Marcus glanced at McCarty, who shook his head. He won't take his body with him wherever he's gone, he murmured quietly. He wouldn't do that with a gun. Wei Anya returned with the two specialists, equipped with tools and bags. After a quick glance at the steel door, one of the men turned to the inspector. It'll take at least an hour unless we risk blowing it off, and you mentioned there might be explosives behind it that could destroy the whole block, he said. I can't guarantee we'll get it done that fast, but we'll move as quickly as we can. Let's check out that diary in the meantime, suggested McCarty. Clara believes there are more doors behind this one, and it could be night time before we get them open. The guys can tell us when they're through. Sounds good. The inspector turned to the two officials. Do you want to join us? If it really is his diary, it could very well be the most bizarre document our department has ever encountered. With a few quick instructions to the others, he led the way back to the sitting room and closed the door. The air was now relatively clear of smoke, leaving only a faint, unpleasant smell behind. McCarty settled into the chair recently occupied by Orbit and pulled open the bottom drawer of the desk. It was crammed with open envelopes covered in cancelled stamps, which he scattered across the floor in his eagerness to empty it. He was telling the truth about the false bottom, he said. I can feel it shift, but how does it open? One of the officials stepped forward. Shall I give it a try, Ty? He asked. I used to be a customs inspector, and I know every smuggler trick there is. It either lifts or slides, and there might be a spring. Go ahead, McCarty replied curtly, and the other man complied. Hey, Ty, the inspector suddenly called out, who chloroformed Orbit the other night. McCarty chuckled. He did it to himself. I figured that out the moment I saw the bottle, there wasn't enough liquid gone to knock out a kitten. The towel was soaked, but only with water, and he just sprinkled enough chloroform on it to make it smell. He didn't want to lose his mind, you see. He only pretended to be unconscious so he could figure out what we were up to and eavesdrop on our conversation. He must have heard us coming up the stairs or somehow realized it was us, because it was Max and me who broke in that night. The next evening, he returned the favor, rigging up a gun to fire at me in the dark, but I found it first and shot it through the roof. That's what I heard, Marcus exclaimed. Good grief. I knew you were too experienced to let it go off by accident, as you told me, but I never imagined you were nearly killed, or I wouldn't have left you there, duty or no duty. There you have it. The detective lieutenant stood up, holding the false bottom of the drawer. This was a surprise even for me, but I figured it out. There are plenty of papers underneath that seem to be torn from a blank book, and they're covered in writing. It's Orbert's. McCarty gathered the loose sheets and spread them out on the desk in front of him. Do you remember when he wrote that list for me right here in this very room of the guests he'd hosted over the last few months? The handwriting matches, and it's dated. It looks just like his diary. Would you like to read it, Inspector? I'm not great at this, and if he uses as many big words as he speaks. Inspector Lucien took the pages from him and sat down near the window. For a long moment he remained silent, scanning the documents, and as he read, his expression darkened and then turned pale. Suddenly, he looked up at McCarty. My God, this is horrifying. The man was the worst scoundrel alive. He must have been insane, but listen. This is dated the 13th. That would have been a week ago last Monday. I managed to replicate it today using the formula and tested it on the white kitten from next door. The results were astonishing. If this had been discovered a few years back, the course of the war might have been different. If only I could conduct an experiment on a human, what a remarkable opportunity that would be for me to experience that final moment that awaits us all. To assume the role of fate, to toy with destiny, to shape lives. This desire consumes me. I cannot find peace until I grasp that ultimate feeling of power. I can't use the gas, though. I dread witnessing the death I would cause, and it must take place far from my home. It will have to be the Tunis bean after all, but who should I choose? Not André. His soufflés are exquisite, and Clara is the only servant who has dusted my room properly and returned everything to its rightful place. Certainly not Ling Sunny or Wei Anya, for one never knows when these quiet, inscrutable individuals might seek revenge. Griffith's help is invaluable to me, yet he contributes little to society. Maybe it would even improve things if he were gone. I must make a choice. That was it, McCarty nodded. The craving for power, to feel like the most important person in the world, ambition twisted into something dark. It was nothing less than a yearning for blood that he would not admit, even to himself. But carry on, sir. What comes next? 2 days later, on the 15th, that was a Wednesday, he writes, it has to be Griffith. The neighbors provide some amusement in their own way, but I can't trust that they would go outside the mall right away. Physostigmine dissolves in alcohol. I could slip a grain or two into some wine and leave it out, but that wouldn't suffice. I must administer it to Griffith myself. I will need to bide my time, then offer him a drink and send him on an errand to a part of town he's unfamiliar with. I can hardly wait. That's the end of that entry, and the next one is recorded at midnight after the murder. It's done. Griffith is dead, and I'm the one who killed him. I could shout, sing, or dance around like a madman celebrating a victory, yet I feel oddly calm, like a deity. I am a god, for I wield the power over life and death, and now I understand what that truly means. The only downside was how effortless it was. Griffith had been indulgent lately, and tonight it struck me that I could take advantage of that. I mixed some bitters with a splash of absinthe, just enough for a single dose, added 2 grains of the powdered bean, and stored it in an old tonic bottle. When Griffith came to prepare my dinner, I noticed he looked poorly, in need of fresh air and exercise, so I urged him to go for a long walk and breathe deeply. Then I offered him the drink I had concocted, poured it out for him myself, and watched it slip down his thick, gluttonous throat. I gazed at him after he set down the glass, unable to believe it was truly done. The man before me was already a dead man, even though he still moved and spoke, and most likely thought about his dinner. It was I who had done this. It was in my hands whether he would live or die, and I had found him guilty and executed him. I will always remember that moment of exquisite thrill, the bliss of absolute power. But I was careful, kept my composure. I cautioned Griffith that the medicine might make him feel slightly unwell, might even tighten his breathing, but he should walk it off, and he would feel much better. He actually thanked me for bringing death upon him. All evening, while Ellison and the Sloanes were here, I kept my triumph to myself, but nothing could diminish my sense of control. My bridge was unmatched, I knew it, and I played the organ like never before. Then it finally happened, the moment I had been waiting for. 3 clueless officers from the police arrived to tell me about Griffith's death. McCarty let out a grim chuckle. Ling Sunny heard that conversation and told me about it just today, between Orbit and Griffith, that is, regarding the medicine. He doesn't mention anything about the fire afterwards, does he? Marcus looked up quickly as the inspector glanced ahead and nodded. Here it is. There was only one flaw in this enchanting evening. I used the powdered bean from the smaller box, and it was just enough. I neglected to open the other box, forgetting how long it had been since its contents had been exposed to air, but I shoved it down into a seam of the cushioned chair, and almost immediately after I went downstairs, spontaneous combustion occurred. What? Marcus leaned forward, tensed, while McCarty chuckled again. I tried to tell you about that Tunis bean in the article we had at the firehouse yesterday afternoon, but you wouldn't listen, he said. I had no idea what spontaneous combustion was until you explained it this morning, never suspecting what was on my mind. But what else does Orbit say about it? He continues, Ling Sunny discovered it, and Wei Anya managed to put it out. Thankfully, they didn't find the box of Tunis bean. He goes on and on about his feelings of power, reveling in it, but that's all. The inspector set the page aside and glanced at the next one. This one is dated Sunday, the 19th. The police were active yesterday, but are quite lost. I have no fear they will uncover anything, even though the one called McCarty seems to possess a fair amount of natural cleverness and logic. No uproarious comedy has ever been so painfully amusing as this investigation, but I am keeping up the act of a regretful employer of a worthy servant. I only wish that I could have used the gas. I prepared a fresh supply today, only to have to let it go to waste. It's infuriating. Griffith's death hasn't eased this urge. If anything, it has only made it stronger. The thought of a violent death, one that I can feel as it unfolds, it's a craving I can't ignore. The shadows in the room were stretching, and the shouts of the crowd outside had faded to a low, restless hum. In the moment of stillness after the inspector finished reading, soft footsteps in slippers approached, and Wei Anya stood before them. The door is open, he said. There's another steel door behind it, even sturdier than the first, but the men are trying a different acid and drill now. Good, Wei Anya. Please turn on the lights, the inspector instructed, gesturing toward the switch. Instantly, the room burst into a bright light from the lamps scattered around. Tell the men to hurry, and let me know when they're done. No one is to enter that room until we arrive. The butler nodded and headed back up the stairs. McCarty glanced at the papers still in the inspector's hands. Is there anything in the diary for Monday? Just this, but it carries weight given what happened afterward. Wei Anya reminded me that I haven't ordered the coal for this season. The dust is dreadful, ruining my flowers and making a mess of everything. I won't arrange for it until the frost comes. Still, there's something captivating and relentless about the way it cascades down the chute like a tiny black avalanche. If we were pygmies, what kind of death could it bring? Oh, it's clear as day, Ty. The man is undeniably mad. His ancestors weren't, at least not all of them, McCarty replied darkly. If the next entry is from Tuesday night, it'll be right after Nathan was killed. It is, Inspector Lucien's voice trembled with disgust. This is the most vile thing, Ty. He must have sat in that very chair where you are now, reveling in his thoughts as he wrote. Once again, I have taken on the role of fate. I have ended a feeble, sickly life, doomed to failure simply because it lacked the strength to face challenges. Weakness, the only sin there is. Had Nathan Ellison lived, he would have desecrated art with his mediocrity, and as I gaze at the masterpieces around me, I rejoice that his pitiful attempts are destined to remain unseen, destined because I willed it. I am fate. It was the luminal that sparked the idea in my mind, though at the time I had no notion of whom I would take. I forgot I had any until I rummaged through my supplies in the lab this morning. Just 2 grains of that innocuous-looking coal tar compound would bring about oblivion in 20 minutes, and the coma would last for 2 or 3 hours, during which death could easily come in a dozen different ways. I toyed with the thought. It captivated me, and I couldn't focus on anything else, even though Giambattista was set to visit this afternoon. How I wished I could relive those intoxicating moments from last Friday night. It was right after lunch, when Nathan came over to ask if he could study my Fragonard for a while. He arrived through the side door, and none of the servants had noticed him. I realized this, and as I looked at him, it struck me how utterly unnecessary his life was, apart from the foolish affection of his parents. What a perfect target for that coal tar compound, and then I recalled the coal that Wei Anya had mentioned yesterday. How simple it would be to render Nathan unconscious, and bury him under a pile of coal. I couldn't resist the idea. It overwhelmed me. I led the boy to my sitting room, got him to drink a glass of milk with 2 miraculous grains of luminal mixed in, and then I went to call the coal dealer. If he couldn't follow through, the boy would wake up none the worse for wear, and my plan would simply be postponed. But everything happened as it should, and when I returned to him, Nathan was already drifting off to sleep. I'll never forget the excruciating suspense of that half-hour. Eventually, Nathan slept, and though I had to call the coal dealer twice more, my plan worked. I managed to carry Nathan to the cellar without being seen, just in time, as the coal arrived, crashing down the chute with a sound as jarring as a roll of drums. I didn't want to watch, just hearing it was enough. I was back in my sitting room, dusting the black soot off my flowers when McCarty and his partner were brought in. I'm not entirely certain about McCarty. I've never underestimated him. He embodies the classic former policeman, down-to-earth, stoic, clinging to routine and lacking imagination. But today, it felt like he was scrutinizing me. He had me figured out, McCarty grinned. That's exactly why I went there. And here I was thinking you were just stalling, not getting anywhere. Marcus shook his head. He had a high opinion of himself, that's for sure, but he didn't think much of you, Ty. Orbit mentions Camden calling to ask about Nathan while you were here, the inspector noted, having read ahead. Then he goes on a rant about the musicale and how he felt Nathan's body right beneath him. He claims that at the organ he outperformed Giambattista on the violin and was drunk on the success of his accomplishments throughout the evening. He played alone later, McCarty said. A strange, childish little tune, yet something about it felt threatening and spiteful. While Max was getting shaved this morning, I discovered what it was. A witch's song from an opera called Hansel and Gretel, right after the old crone lures the children to her house and does away with them. That should have warned me, if I had understood what it meant. He doesn't mention planning another murder, does he? Marcus asked. He must have gone off the rails when he committed one the very next day. The lab is open now, sir. Way Anya appeared so silently that it was as if he had materialized on the threshold. There's no one inside. No one, the inspector jumped up with a shout, stuffing the papers into his pocket. Good heavens, he has escaped after all. I doubt it, sir, McCarty said thoughtfully. Perhaps the men outside missed him, but we shouldn't waste any time. They hurried up the stairs and past the two massive steel doors, swinging lazily on their twisted hinges, entering a long, low room that looked just as Clara had described. The closed cupboards beneath the shelves were too small to conceal a person, and there was no other hiding spot or means of escape except the door they had just come through. We've been fooled, Ty, the inspector lamented again, shaking his head. Unless the boys outside caught him, we're in for a long chase. No, McCarty replied, gazing thoughtfully at the large circular vat that dominated the center of the room, rising 6 or 7 feet like a miniature gas tank. Could you hand me that stepladder, Max? I want to check if it's empty. By the smell of it, it's definitely not, Marcus remarked. It's worse than asafoetida. He brought the ladder, and McCarty climbed up cautiously, peering over the top. The vat seemed filled almost to the brim with a thick, murky liquid, an oily film floating on the surface. After staring into it for several moments, he climbed down, his ruddy face pale and marked by greenish shadows. Ty, Marcus caught him supportively as he swayed. You look sick. Come away from this. Orbit's not here. If I'm feeling sick, it's from what's rattling around in my head, Max, McCarty replied, his voice trembling. Where does that pipe go from the bottom of the vat? To that large container over there, the detective lieutenant responded, pointing. It's probably to drain whatever's in there. Then turn the valve, would you? McCarty suddenly sank onto a nearby bench, cradling his head in his hands. I need to see what's at the bottom of that vat. The inspector looked taken aback, and Marcus gaped, but neither of them said anything. One of the officials climbed the ladder while the other turned the valve. A gurgling sound followed by a rush of liquid streamed through the narrow, sturdy pipe. It's draining, the man on the ladder shouted. Whatever this greasy substance is, it's flowing through the pipe, no problem. What do you think is down there, Ty? I'd rather not think about it until I have to, McCarty groaned. Let me know if it stops running before the vat is empty. But the official remained silent, and the waiting felt endless. Finally, after what seemed like the longest half-hour of their lives, he announced, "The vat's almost empty, Ty. Aside from some scum, it's cleaner than the floor. There are 6 little things rolling around at the bottom that look like pebbles. Should I climb down and grab them?" "For heaven's sake, no." McCarty jumped to his feet. "That would be instant death, and a gruesome one if you touch whatever's left in there. Go ask Andre for a lead spoon from the kitchen, and make sure it's lead." The man hurried off, and McCarty shrugged off his coat. He climbed the ladder and perched on the edge of the vat, while Marcus shouted anxious warnings from below. Then he pulled up the ladder, secured it inside the vat, and when the detective returned with the requested spoon, he carefully stepped down to the lowest rung and scooped up the 6 grey pellets from the sludge at the bottom. Once he had climbed back down carefully, protecting his discovery with the utmost caution, the others gathered around him, and he felt a shiver as he spoke to the inspector. "That vat is lined with lead, sir. Nothing but lead could contain that substance, as it eats through everything as if it were never there. You see, the ladder was deliberately fitted with lead tips at its feet, or it would have melted under my weight. I've heard of this stuff but never seen it before. It's hydrofluoric acid. It can eat through steel and rock, and flesh and bone, without leaving a trace. Do you understand me?" "I do, but it's terrifying," the inspector shuddered. "Are you saying that orbit? Was that what he meant by annihilation?" McCarty nodded. "Remember, there's only one thing that can resist it, and that's lead. This is all that remains of Henry Orbit, the 6 bullets from his revolver." Chapter 23. "Shall we continue?" the inspector asked. It was nearly midnight, and the time since that dreadful hour in the laboratory had been consumed by the necessary formalities following the final tragedy. He, McCarty, and Marcus were alone once again in Orbit's sitting room, as the other 2 officials had returned to headquarters. As he spoke, he pulled from his pocket the remaining pages of the diary. "That's what Orbit wanted," McCarty replied quietly. "He's poured his essence, whatever it was, into those pages, and though it's something I'd rather not unleash upon the world, we know the worst of him, and we ought to uncover the rest." Marcus was still reeling from the shocks of the day. He didn't say anything, but his eyes, full of a kind of odd fascination, followed the inspector's hands as he sorted through the papers. "Wednesday night," the inspector settled himself to read. "For the 3rd time this week I have taken a life, but the reaction is not the same. The initial exhilaration was present, but the thrill is gone, or perhaps it has transformed into a sensation I've never experienced before. Is it fear? I truly cannot say. Today I finished generating the gas for the 3rd time, and feeling certain I had the formula committed to memory, I destroyed it, ensuring that my knowledge belongs solely to me. The desire for a meaningful experiment became an obsession, and in genuine agony, tormented by my thoughts, I sat at the organ, seeking solace. For the first time, music brought me no relief, and I felt suffocated. I went to one of the windows to open it and noticed Isolde, the French maid from next door, with little Maud Thorne. The child had a new blue balloon, and suddenly an idea struck me. What if it were filled with the poison gas and they were locked in a room? I invited them in to listen to the organ and offered Maud some candy. As I had hoped, she forgot about her toy and dropped it. I picked it up and excused myself for just a moment, just long enough to hurry to my laboratory, deflate the balloon, and refill it with gas. When I returned to the conservatory, Isolde and the baby were still engrossed in the candy. I handed the balloon to the child and then settled back in front of the organ. Handel's Largo filled my mind, and how I played. The thought that the toy might burst at any moment tingled in my mind. I found myself listening intently, tormented by suspense because it didn't happen. I stole a glance at my guests. They sat side by side on the marble bench with a towering cactus just behind them, its spikes looming over their shoulders. If that balloon were to float toward one of them, if a breath of air sent it against one of those enormous thorns while the child held it straight up. A louder, almost crescendo moment arrived in the music, and I pressed the swell pedal with my foot, urging the keys beneath my fingers. The shutters of the swell box opened wide, and a rush of air burst forth, matching the volume of sound. But cutting through that glorious harmony came a sudden, sharp report. I couldn't stop playing. I feared others in the house might have heard it, and I didn't even dare to look around. Never had the Largo seemed so endless, but finally, just as I reached the end, I heard the patter of Maud's little feet. The baby had slipped away from me. I whirled around and saw her playing a few feet away, but Isolde was slumped back, lifeless, with the remnants of the balloon at her feet. I rushed to open the windows, intent on dispersing the deadly vapors that might linger in the air and betray me. Once the room was clear, I raised the alarm. McCarty and his associate were passing by, and with supreme confidence I called them in, reveling in their bewilderment. But the balloon had vanished. Once the doctor and the medical examiner's assistant had left, and the body had been taken away while the baby was sent home, I noticed something missing, the balloon. Deep down, I felt, I knew that McCarty must have it. He must suspect something. Sir Victor has arrived, but he's busy writing an important letter, so I took a moment to write this down. I'm heading out. I have McCarty's address, and I need to find out more. Later, I confirmed that McCarty did have the balloon. He and his associate left the entrance door unlocked, and fortunately, one of the keys I had matched the lock of his apartment. I found the remnants of the balloon and brought it back, but that now seems relatively unimportant. With the realization that he actually suspects me, a strange new sensation washes over me. Before, I held all the power. I could take a life whenever I wanted. But now, I must kill to protect myself. From being the master, I've become a slave. But a slave to what? I shall need that key once more. Of course he did, McCarty nodded. I mentioned the revolver waiting for me on a pulley the next night, but I'm curious how he managed to get his hands on a police issue. The inspector commented. He explains that on the next page. Here it is. I have just set a trap for him in his rooms, and he will undoubtedly walk right into it. But this has cost me the service revolver I picked up during one of my solitary walks down on the east side, right after a young policeman was killed by gangsters, and his body had just been taken away. There's a sense of retributive justice in my actions tonight, especially since McCarty and his associate broke in here last night. I pretended to chloroform myself, hoping to overhear their conversation to understand why they had come and how strong their suspicions were against me. But McCarty opened my windows and hurried his associate out. Could he have figured out my plan? I'm afraid I know the answer now, but it is McCarty I fear. To each person, he is undeniably beneath me, yet there's something about him that makes me feel less powerful. Is it because of what he represents? I'm above the law and out of its grasp, but perhaps it's because he embodies the law, the collective will of society, that my own strength feels so weak. Those are grand words, McCarty scoffed. He was just getting nervous, that's all. He let his obsession with murder get the best of him, and when he realized he wasn't pulling it off, he lost his nerve. I'm not so sure, Ty, Marcus disagreed, shaking his head. Any man who could plan such an end for himself as he did doesn't lack guts, even if he is a cold-hearted, black-blooded fiend. I think he figured it out. It was the fear of the law, the idea that every man would turn against him, that forced him into a corner. There's only one more entry, the inspector noted. This one is dated Thursday, and the next is from Friday, the 24th. That would be yesterday, or rather last night. Let's hear it, Inspector. All right, I have failed. This morning, alive and unharmed, McCarty came to the mall. I cannot hurt him. I am powerless against him. He is the law. But regarding the man himself, I underestimated him. He is sharper and more calculating than I imagined. Today he came to me, and in Sir Victor's presence, with remarkable finesse, he hinted that he knows I was the one who tried to take his life. It seems he bears no grudge. It appears to be just part of the game. He claims to have detected the cigar smoke I left behind in his rooms, just as his associate caught the scent of the little fire from the physostigmine. He also made it clear that he was aware of my attempt with the chloroform, and he lied about insignificant details, fully knowing that I understood the truth. Tonight, he showed up again with completely trivial questions, and it's clear now that he's really studying me, trying to make up his mind. I have this strange, almost unexplainable feeling, a conviction that he will come out on top in this competition between us. If he does, I'll know what to do. From this moment on, I'll be ready. I'm the last of my lineage, and for such a lineage there can only be one end, complete annihilation. I feel a strange urge for him to read these pages, and if he wins, I'll make sure they reach him. It's getting late, and I'm exhausted. I wonder what tomorrow will bring. That's it, Ty. That's the final word. Well, now he knows. McCarty let out a deep breath. I'm glad that's behind us. It's going to take me forever to forget these last 10 days, I can tell you. There's still a lot that confuses me, Marcus said thoughtfully. For one thing, Ty, you mentioned that Griffith fell ill suddenly. I didn't hear anything about that. You did, Max, just like I did. You just didn't pick up on it. All the other servants talked about how he started his dinner with such enthusiasm, then suddenly lost his appetite, even for his favorite dishes. It was that Tunis bean making him sick at first. He got outside and walked around like he'd been advised, poor guy, until he just collapsed. But in the end, he understood what was happening. Do you remember the horror in his eyes, and how hard he tried to speak and tell me? But what made you suspect the truth, Ty? The inspector asked. Was it the toy balloon? Partly. Also, when Anya called us into the conservatory, and we found Isolde lying there dead, it seemed to me that Orbit was a little too calm and composed, despite all his eloquent words. He had his story rehearsed perfectly, speaking smoothly instead of in the choppy manner typical of someone on the verge of panic. Every word seemed crafted for effect, as if he were performing a part. He also seemed to forget it quickly. Just yesterday, while Sir Victor spoke about Isolde's death, he appeared more entertained by how awkwardly the British man was articulating his thoughts than he was saddened by the murder, despite the fact that the girl had barely been laid to rest. After I left him, I stopped at a small place to grab a bite to eat, and while I waited, I was feeling pretty low because I couldn't see my way clear like I used to in the old days. It struck me that I had been losing my touch since I stepped away from it all, and I kind of wished I were back in the game, though I recalled well what a miserable existence it could be in some respects. That's just the phrase that popped into my head, a dog's life, and then I thought of Max. He was always hanging around that coal chute, as if there was something down there he wanted. Then it hit me. The coal was being delivered when the boy went missing, and the entire realization overwhelmed me. But you said you had the key to it all along, Marcus interjected. I did. It was this. McCarty pulled a thin pamphlet bound in blue paper from his pocket. You both teased me about diving into this psychology stuff to keep up with the others back at headquarters, but I was becoming invested and wanted every bit of information that might be relevant. The first night we came here to inform Orbit that his valet was dead, I found this hidden behind some other books in the library, and I borrowed it. It turned out to be nothing substantial, just a family history, like a sermon on heredity, and I noticed it had been published in London. I started to read it, curious about why Orbit would show any interest in such a thing, and I was astounded by the kind of crew they had. From stealing sheep to assassinating kings, there was nothing they wouldn't pursue, and I'd wager that hardly 1 in 10 lived to die peacefully in their beds. They were quite a notorious family, the Jessops. Jessops, the inspector echoed. That's the family I mentioned this morning, though I couldn't recall the name. They're notorious, especially when compared to the illustrious record of the Websters. Absolutely, McCarty said with a grin. Then his expression turned serious. I suspected as much, as I'd spent quite a bit of time in the library on Thursday digging into both families, but I didn't bring it up because Orbit himself is the last of the Jessops. Orbit. His maternal grandmother was the daughter of old Gideon Jessop, who was hanged down south for highway robbery and murder. One of his daughters went insane, and 2 of his sons were convicts. But really, there's no need to delve into all that. You'll recall you said the male lines of the family died out long ago, but it turns out there been no record kept of the females, except for this little book here. I planned to tell Webster in the morning, as he wouldn't spread such gossip, and there's something I need to know. If heredity means anything at all, it doesn't seem like Henry Orbit had much of a chance. I can hardly believe it, gentlemen, Benjamin Webster exclaimed. The news that Henry Orbit has taken his own life in some mysterious way, leaving behind a written confession, struck me like a thunderclap. But now that you've told me that the blood of the Jessops runs in his veins, it makes many things clearer. Did you ever meet Orbit, Mr. Webster? McCarty asked. Did you ever speak to him?
Once.
It was 2 years ago, but the experience, while seemingly insignificant, was so unsettling that it has lingered in my mind. He paused, glancing toward the window where sunlight streamed in, listening to the distant chime of church bells. I returned home quite late from a meeting of a charitable organization. It was pouring rain, and I had forgotten my gate key. The watchman was taking refuge in a doorway far down the street. I couldn't get his attention and was soaked to the skin. Suddenly, someone approached from behind and said, "Let me help you, Mr. Webster," as they opened the gate for me. I was taken aback, as the voice was unfamiliar, but in the glow of the street lamp I recognized Henry Orbit. You know his face, you've heard his voice, and you've felt the pull of his presence. But did you also sense that unsettling feeling of antagonism, almost as if he repelled you? Like you wanted to shrink away from his touch, avoid breathing the same air? I can't say that I have, Mr. Webster, the inspector responded thoughtfully. You mean as if he were a venomous creature? No, up until yesterday, I believed Orbit was a respectable man. He had me fooled. I mean as if he embodied all things malevolent. Webster's voice dropped to a whisper. I didn't feel that strong impression right away, but I did sense a strange aversion to him despite his charming demeanor. He walked down the street with me, assuming his company was wanted, and I did my best to respond warmly. After all, he had just done me a favor. When we reached my house, I paused to thank him again for his kindness, and was about to bid him farewell when he surprised and unsettled me by inviting me into his home for a bit. He confided that he felt lonely, a deep sadness taking hold of him, and he would be truly grateful if I could spare him half an hour. I couldn't very well refuse, though I accepted his invitation with a reluctance that seemed excessive. His house, though modest in size, was more beautiful than any palace I had seen in my travels, filled with priceless art, yet for reasons I couldn't articulate, my unease morphed into genuine horror. A tall Chinese servant took my hat, and Henry Orbit led me to his library, insisting I have refreshments while he spoke eloquently on various topics. I tried to listen and respond amiably, but my irrational loathing for him only intensified, and I yearned, more intensely than I had ever yearned for anything, to be back in the storm, anywhere but in that house. I know this must sound like madness, but I can't even explain it to myself. All I know is that, as the moments passed, my dread grew, and then I committed an unforgivable act. I stood up in the middle of his sentence, and without a word of explanation or excuse, I fled the house. I still can't pinpoint what drove me to it, nor could I have justified it then beyond an overpowering impulse. I had never felt such aversion for a stranger in my life. You went out into the storm, Mr. Webster, without your hat? McCarty asked suddenly. The inspector stifled a half-heard gasp, and Marcus stared. I honestly don't remember, but I must have, because I clearly recall the cold rain pelting my bare head as I crossed the street, and I was oddly thankful for it. So you left your hat behind in Orbit's house, McCarty continued. Can you recall what it was like, Mr. Webster? Was it possibly a soft, dark felt? Probably. I rarely wear anything else. Then Webster started slightly. You don't mean? Could it really have been my hat that the unfortunate valet was wearing when he collapsed? It appears so, especially since your initials were on it, McCarty replied. That was the last piece we hadn't figured out. But why, sir? Marcus finally spoke up. Why did you feel that way about Orbit? He seemed to charm everyone else. I think I have an idea, though it might sound a bit far-fetched coming from me, Mr. Webster. We know who your family is and their history. It's certainly something to be proud of. It's something to be grateful for, Mr. Webster replied modestly. But I would like to hear your thoughts. Well, we know who the Jessops were, too, and I believe the good in you, which you didn't create, and the darkness in him, which he couldn't escape, recognized each other right away, and your instinct told you to keep your distance. That may be true. Mr. Webster regarded him with a mix of wonder and respect. I think you've captured it, Mr. McCarty, the good and evil that men do endure long after them. It felt to me as if sinister forces were swirling around me in that house, and I was standing before a monster. I never even considered making excuses for my behavior or asking for my hat. There's just one thing I'm curious about, though it's unrelated to the murders. Have you noticed this? It was found with your documents when they came into our possession. He held out the silver leaf, and Mr. Webster's face brightened. Ah, that's the bookmark I slipped into my encyclopedia. I had told you a leaf was missing. I'm truly glad to have this back, as it's a keepsake from a dear friend, an English army officer who was stationed in South Africa. It's from Table Mountain, isn't it, from a silver tree? McCarty smiled as he stood up. Mr. Webster, we won't keep you any longer. The trouble has finally come to an end here in the mall, I believe, and no more evil will emerge from that house over there. And you three have restored our peace in an astonishing way, Mr. Webster said, extending his hand. Without you and the chance that guided you to the truth, I shudder to think of the horrors that could have befallen us. I can't speak for any divine intervention, McCarty replied, his eyes sparkling. I'm not one for giving advice usually, but if I were to share just a single piece of it with you, sir, it would be this. Going forward, be very careful about where you place your hat. The end.